Okay, so our next speaker is Rebecca Noble from East Midlands, refining clerking admissions process in cancer services at the Royal Derby Hospital. Okay.
So good afternoon, I'm Rebecca Noble. I'm currently a CT2 at the Royal Derby Hospital, and I'll be talking to you today about my quality improvement project, which was refining the clerking admissions process in cancer services at Derby Hospital. So just to give you a bit of background, cancer services runs separately from acute and general medicine at Derby Hospital and encompasses haematology, oncology and palliative care. For the purposes of this project, I focus only on haematology and oncology because palliative care have their own admissions process. So patients at Derby can be admitted to cancer services via one of three routes. Out of hours, they go through general medicine via the medical assessment unit, and then within hours, they can either be admitted directly to one of the cancer wards or via the combined day unit, which is for planned outpatient chemotherapy, blood transfusions, and unwell reviews. So these patients can be both emergency and elective admissions. And we noticed as a team while I was working on haematology that actually there seemed to be a huge variation in the quality of documentation on admission for patients who are admitted directly to the ward or from CDU. And so that was the basis of which I based my project. So the aim of the project was to understand the areas of weakness in the current admissions process and then to use that to create a solution which standardised the admissions process for cancer services. So we did that by using the PDSA cycle. So I established the aims, designed a clerking performer and also a data collection tool. I collected data over a 2-week period for patients admitted to haematology, implemented the change, which is the clerking performer, piloted it in haematology, and then re-audited the same number of patients a couple of weeks after it had been implemented. I then analysed the data before and after the clerking book was introduced, and then rolled it out to cover oncology as well. So this is a graph showing the types of admissions before the booklet was introduced, and this shows that the majority of patients were actually admitted electively, but that all the emergency admissions came by the combined day unit. So these are often the sicker patients, neutropenic sepsis. So these patients probably are in need of a greater detailed clerking and early senior discussion and review. This is a graph of the clerking components that were completed set between the wards and combined day unit, and you can see that there's a huge discrepancy here in the quality of the documentation between the wards and those patients admitted via the CDU. Of particular concern was this area here. So initial management plans are only documented in 70% of patients admitted via the combined day unit, and we've already established that these patients are more likely to be emergency admissions. There was very little discussion with seniors documented, and no escalation plans or handover to the ward teams. So this confirmed what we thought, that there was a huge variation. So we then implemented a change. So I designed this clerking performer, which I'll just very quickly talk through. So it's got this sort of haematology, oncology specific background with the reason that they're being admitted, whether the admission's planned or unplanned. Generic past medical history, drug history, social history, EWS and observations, an area to record results and investigations, and summary and initial management plan with the tick box there for the risk assessments, and any escalation planning that's been made or whether that hasn't actually been discussed. And finally, the name of the senior clinician that's the patient has been discussed with, and any communication with the patients and relatives. So after we implemented this change, I went back and looked at the same number of patients again, and actually the type of admission had shifted to predominantly emergency admissions, which I think can be accounted for by the fact that I was then was collecting the data in January, so we were well within the winter months. But again, the pattern was the same, that the vast majority were coming through the combined day unit. So because of the discrepancy between the two areas, I've broken the second set of results down into the ward and then the combined day unit. So this is just looking at the ward. They were performing generally quite well before, but there's been an improvement in the quality of documentation after the introduction of the clerking performer. The only area where they did worse was actually the documentation of initial management plan, which I think is explained by the fact that a lot of these patients are electively admitted for chemotherapy, and some of the juniors felt that the reason for admission meant that the management plan was fairly intuitive. Then looking at the combined day units, this area, it was the area that was performing very poorly initially. You can see that there's been huge improvements in the quality of the documentation after the introduction of the clerking performer, although there's clearly some work still to be done because we're not really hitting the numbers that we would like. Just looking at this all together, so this is the total documentation before and after the implementation of the clerking performer, and you can see that overall there's been an increase in documentation for all the areas of clerking, risk assessment, stat medications, etc. And just to highlight again the area of concern that I've highlighted previously, particularly around senior discussions, less than 30% of patients had a documented discussion with a senior clinician on admission, and after the clerking book was introduced, that went to greater than 60%. Obviously that's not where we'd like it to be, but it's a huge improvement. And just looking at the same information in a different way, before the book was introduced, only 48% of all of the clerking components were completed for all patients admitted to haematology. After the clerking book was introduced, that went to 77%, which is a huge improvement, although there's clearly still some work to be done. So next steps, as I've said, there's still work to be done. That 77% is a huge improvement from 48%, but I'd like it to be greater than 90, closer to 100%. After the success of the pilot within haematology, the form has been rolled out to cover oncology as well and is now being used across all of cancer services except for palliative care. I presented my findings at the departmental meeting for haematology to create increased consultant awareness of the work that had been done, and it will form part of the education at the junior doctors induction when they're inducted into cancer services. And I plan to re-audit the information in October, which will give the new take some chance to get to grips with the document. That's it. Any questions?
Thank you very much for that. Great example of a document making a process more reliable. But this has got a lot of components to it, this process. So I'm wondering if you've thought about what else, other than education, which is always the next stopping place, that we're going to go and you're going to go to get those handover processes and that senior engagement. What other things are you going to try? Because I suspect what you're showing on your data is that's resistant to just a document that's very smart and easy to use.
I think some of it lies within sort of the seniors, so registrars and the consultants who are there more consistently being aware of the document and trying to encourage it being used. The vast majority of the patients that I re-audited the second time had the clerking performer filled in, and it is all fairly intuitive if you use the performer. So I think it's about educating seniors and trying to encourage them to encourage people to use it, as well as making sure that it forms part of the induction for the junior doctors each time they rotate, because this form is different to the ones that are used elsewhere.
So one quick question, have you asked the patients whether they have any feedback on the use of the form? Because that seems to me to be a place that you haven't gone to, and as regular attenders, they'll be concerned about it.
Yeah, that's not an aspect that we looked at, but it's certainly something that we could think about in the future and might encourage people to use it more. Yeah.
This isn't a criticism of yours, but it's a comment on medicine, I think. When I was a house officer, which is 40 years ago now, my first boss said to me, your job's to keep the notes in order. And it's to do exactly what this was. It's to put down history, examination, examine the patient every day, write down what I've done. And if things didn't work, he used to go apeshit. Now, I don't regard that as a quality improvement project, but it certainly brought a fair amount of terror into the junior staff. So why do you think that we keep needing to remind people about the basics?
It was interesting coming, so everywhere else in the hospital has a clerking performer, and cancer services had chosen not to use that generic performer because they weren't happy with it. But what they hadn't created, which we now have done, is another one. And so it left people sort of free rein, and some of perhaps the FY1s and FY2s were doing the full structured history and examination, but those sort of going up perhaps didn't have so much. So we just designed something that sort of replaced it.
It's a good answer.
Hi, I totally agree with your assessment of that, by the way, just at the end there. So I also work in an oncology and haematology centre, and we have a performer not dissimilar to the one that you've designed. I just wondered, just out of interest, what is the difference? Who's clerking patients in CDU versus the wards? So, like, could that explain the difference?
So generally, the patients who are admitted directly to the wards are clerked by the F2s or CTs or F1s. CDUs generally staffed by staff grades or sort of registrars, associate specialists. So they are sort of more experienced, but perhaps don't document so much. And actually, some of the outliers come from sort of the consultant clerking. Sometimes they're not filling in everything that the juniors would.
I guess it's our experience as well, which I guess kind of backs up what you
Yeah.
were just saying before. Yeah, thanks.
So thank you very much.